Hi, Jamie.
Hi, good morning.
Here we are again. It's Sunday morning, and wow, you have been prolifically writing over the last couple of weeks. I know we didn't get to see each other last week, but in the last week, there has been so much for us to digest and to reflect upon and think about. And so many, as I often find with your articles, is when I'm reading them, is I'm thinking about how much they reflect some of the thoughts, but also help me to reflect on what's happening within the schools that I'm visiting and the students that I'm supporting. So, thinking about today's article, the whole of it as accommodation, I guess there seem to be lots of themes coming through and thinking about how what the systems look like for some of our autistic students. And just before we came on, we were talking about what do people ask? What is this environment like for you? Um, I think in some cases there might be schools that are really forward thinking and thinking about the what that sensory environment might be like. But as we were saying, have they thought about that light that for that autistic student is glaring down at them, almost like penetrating their whole body, sending their whole system off. At the same time, they're being bombarded with noise. The corridor, there's people going past. At the same time, there's a lawn being mowed outside. And at the same time, they've got this other olfactory sensation of the teacher's scent that is really overwhelming for them. And it's all coming in and it's bombarding. And that's
Well,
what, yeah,
I know you're not talking about my perfume because my perfume is just epic and everybody loves it. And I think a couple of things that I want to kind of address first,
yeah.
before we kind of talk about the thing. But we use the word article,
Mm.
because it's on Substack,
Yeah,
and Substack is where you put articles, but they're not articles. They're scripts. They're, whole gestalts. It's where I park them. That's
yeah,
um, my version of delayed echolalia. Only, at my age, is not a nursery rhyme. It's 5,000 words, right?
yeah,
And I have to get out of my head. And so a lot of kind of feedback from people who are on the periphery that didn't know me or nothing like that, they sometimes they push in a bit. And this happened very recently with the classroom ecology piece, which is not the first one. The classroom ecology concept, that's 4 years old. The
yeah.
very first very long form piece that I put on Substack was about classroom ecologies and
Mm,
alexithymia, and so this is me kind of circling the same thing. But
mm,
one of the comments from a reader was that I was not offering a remedy. I was not offering, the 10-point plan to solve this problem. And I thought to myself, well, that's not what I'm doing here. I am just getting all of this stuff out of my head. I'm
yeah,
putting it there, and that people connect with it and that they read it. Um, that's a happiness, that's a joy. But
yeah.
that's not what this is all about. And that's why
No,
for me, it's free to access. I don't write for other people, and I know that sounds maybe a bit arrogant or something, but for me, it's a bit of therapy, it's a bit of occupational therapy, a bit of speech therapy, it's a bit of parking these long form gestalts, and so I get kind of nervous, because I do academic publishing and I do write books and stuff and stories, and those are stories, those are papers, those are proper articles
yeah,
and stuff. But to me, it's just kind of an old person yelling at her phone on the drive to work. Well, there's the poem, and then later on, I kind of pick it apart and there's the field notes. And then I realize that you can just drop that and, so I need some kind of introductory stuff so that 4 years from now, when I read it, oh yeah, that's what I was on about, Jamie. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Um, and that's kind of the form that I've followed lately. So kind of with that positioning, right? It's
Yeah.
not a manifesto or anything.
No, no.
Um, I
And I'm
wrote,
sorry. And I'm sorry, Jamie, because I actually know this. I know because I've known you for, I don't know, 8 months since we started planning the conference. And so actually I do know that. I know that this is your your script. We talk about it regularly, but I guess sometimes it's just finding the right word. So I'm sorry. I will
it's
remember
it's
that.
it's no need to apologize or anything. I think, you know, between you and I and Sunday mornings with Jamie and Cathy and stuff, we've picked up a lot of people along the way who are tuning
Mm,
in now through Instagram and whatnot. So I kind of feel like I have to kind of reintroduce myself. Hi, I'm Dr.
yeah.
Jamie Horrocks. This is what this is all about. And so, to that end, I felt kind of a dividing in the force, if you will. And that's now I have two substacks, but they both kind of circle each other.
Yeah.
And so today's piece on sensor residue is kind of a critique of the DSM and those diagnostic criteria for autism. And it says this, and then I say, and I write that down, and then what's the implications? That's the so part. And that's one of the devices that I use in my instructions. It says, I say, and so. And I think it's a very kind of gestalt processor way of breaking it down from whole to part.
Mm.
Um, but back to your original question about classrooms and stuff. I was I was talking with a colleague, and there is kind of a hidden curriculum, not just for students, but for staff.
Yeah.
And I was trying to explain something to her that, she's in charge of organizing all of the professional development. And she was telling me all of these wonderful things that she had done and organized for like a teacher's choice day. You can choose which topic you want to go and the teacher that is focusing on that. And not to get too detailed, but there were some topics that I might be very curious about. But
Mm.
when it was mentioned, like it's this staff member in their room, I can feel my chest tightening. I can
Yeah.
feel a bit of anxiety come on because I don't feel safe in that room from an ecology standpoint. Not obviously from a physical safety standpoint, because,
No, no.
you know, my teacher colleagues are not going to attack me, right?
Yeah.
But there are certain places, and every adult who's on a Gestalt processor, I think, whether we name it or not, there is this
Mm.
calculus that happens. You must go to this place, Jamie. I can feel my chest tightening. I didn't want to go there, right? I don't feel safe. Whether it's, they have them atomizing canisters that makes it smell like a roadside restroom, even though it's supposed to be eucalyptus and patchouli or whatever. But for me, it smells horrible and it's oppressive, and you can't get away from it in this classroom. Or it's the lights that are on, or it's the joyful vibrancy that they try to produce in the atmosphere where everybody's moving, everybody's talking, and you cannot get a moment's peace in your head, right?
Yeah.
And so, for me, I set up my own classroom differently. I was very kind of deliberate in finding the classroom that I'm in, and technologically, nothing in my classroom works. The projector doesn't work. Some of the blinds do not work. But in the sense that they do not work, the blind that does not close faces southward. So I have beautiful natural light coming. I'm above the ground floor, so I have this beautiful natural light coming. So I didn't have to turn on the lights. It's light enough.
Yeah.
Um, obviously I don't have, scents and smells and stuff, and I have some just kind of light background music on. Um, I have candy for those that like a sweet treat or something. I have fidgets, I have stems, I have Lego, I have all of these kinds of things so that, if you're trying to regulate, you can grab a box of Lego and you can build something, you can grab a fidget and you can moderate yourself. Um, but my classroom looks nothing like my colleagues' classrooms, and it's not intentional. It's just I'm creating this ecology because I have to live in it. It's my
Yeah. Yeah.
classroom, but
Yeah.
also because, the students that I have they're very much like me in that aspect. They go into these classrooms where it's essentially the teacher's nest, right? And everything about that classroom is reflective of the personality of the teacher on purpose. And it's not just, here's my diplomas and pictures of my family
Hmm.
and stuff, but it's the sounds and the smells and the sights and the busyness and all of that kind of stuff is the teacher's preference.
Hmm.
And when I ask questions about, do you imagine the student who's coming to your class? What do you know about them? What kind of soil do they need to grow? And they look at me like I'm from Mars or something. Like, have you not read the evidence about how we need all of this joyful noise? Like, I've read it and I put it in the bin. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And so do you uh do your students, do you feel, do they recognize that when they come into the room? And do they recognize it that it isn't there perhaps in other classes that they go to?
Well, I don't think they're explicit in, oh, let's go to Dr. H's class, and announcing it as such. But what I have noticed is that for the students who are on my roster, oftentimes they suggest to friends in other classrooms during the same time, hey, why don't you come study with me in Dr. H's classroom? And
Mm.
and so just kind of quietly over the years, I have a bit of a following, not from the standpoint of me, but from my classroom, the space.
Yeah.
And last year I started doing kind of a quiet room. So when there's assembly, when there's a big function or whatever that's going to be in an enclosed space like the basketball gym, and there's going to be noise and echo and all this kind of stuff, I have negotiated with the principal to say, I'm going to open up my classroom, and those that can handle that, they can come. They can do whatever they want, but it will be
Yeah.
quiet and it would be calm. And not only because I didn't want to be in there anyways, I don't want to be in this big echoey gym. So there's madness to that method, but um, every year that has grown, and obviously I kind of have full capacity or beyond full capacity, but um, every chair is taken at this point,
Mm.
and not because of publicity or whatever, just the kiddos they spread the word, and
Yeah.
it's not like I'm walking around saying sign here to say thank you, Jamie. It's just, the thanks is the kids in the room being properly regulated. That's the nice thing for me.
Yeah. And so, and then that opens up communication. And I suppose that's where I was going to go next with our chat today, thinking about what you've been writing about this week. And, again, going back to another theme about how gestalt processing, thinking, language really um, challenges developmental norms and those that are looking at developmental norms, because it isn't a it totally is so different from the developmental norms that we've grown up um, that we studied at university. And so I wonder if part of some of people's wanting to find out the evidence is, as we've talked about before, the evidence is there. It's just not in the current research that is available immediately at our fingertips.
Yes. You can write articles, you can write books, you can write journal papers, you can connect patterns, and you can trace the lineage back 100 years for this.
Mm,
And you will find that people who are open to hearing about this message or whatever we want to call it will
mm,
be open to it. And those that they have their method, they have their way, and they will not be swayed by whatever. Um, they are kind of frozen in time, and I find that kind of static self to be a bit sad, actually. You
mm,
know, I I think my autism is showing here, but I'm very curious, and that sensory seeking part of autism extends into knowledge, and the sensory brain, and I want to know things. I'm curious about things. on that same curiosity that we see in children, that same wandering about. I do it academically. It's like, oh, what's this paper? What's it on about? And then I read it and I look at the references and I try to trace the lineage and
Mm,
connect the dots. And sometimes that ends up in Substack. Sometimes that ends up in an academic journal paper or whatever. Um, but I am curious. And I think the frustrating thing for me professionally is that I come across a lot of adults who are no longer curious about things. And I think, at least in America, a part of the system kind of reinforces that lack of curiosity because you're told when you onboard as a teacher that the science is settled, right?
yeah.
You start with phonemes and phonics, and you start with these sight words and CVC words, and you eventually build up to a whole vocabulary. And so for someone like me to come in and say, well, that's not how it works for me. I'm the deviation. I'm the problem to be solved. And when I try to chat to people, they've had their minds made up. And there are whole academies in literacy and stuff that have captured the market and enclosed the imagination. And when you point out that they've cheated, that they've fabricated, that they've bribed, and that most of it is just marketing and
Mm,
sloganeering, and there's no actual science behind the science of reading, it's there's a cognitive dissonance. They can like,
mm,
no, because I heard about this science of reading and it's science, and so therefore it's like, well, no, I mean the science of reading has been around for a long time. It was in schools when I was going through school, and it's part of the reason why I graduated school illiterate, because they
hmm.
could not recognize who was sitting in front of them. And because they cannot recognize that I was different, they
Yeah,
just moved on.
yeah,
And they weren't curious about it. Why is Jamie not reading? Why is Jamie not understanding, comprehending? You know, why does Jamie have prosody but no comprehension?
yeah,
And I think about, some of the children that I support that are hyperlexic. And then you
yeah.
ask, stop them and ask them a question. Okay, what did that mean? I don't know, but it sounds great.
But I do. So I think there are moments now that are happening, certainly in some of the schools where I'm working, where some of the teaching staff are saying, actually, this person that I'm supporting, and they're usually quite young children. Gosh, they're reading, they're hyperlexic. They may not be using that word hyperlexic, but the other thing that I've sort of just found um, just fantastic is that recognizing that actually some of these children are not learning through phonics. Phonics is not for them. And these teachers are coming to me and saying, this isn't for them, this is not working, and asking about other ways that maybe they could support some of these children that are learning in holes. And so we talk about it and we think about, well, how could we put some of this into their day? Can we have some of their favorite scripts written around activities that they really enjoy? Can we make up some their own storybooks or their own books, homemade books about themselves, about their day, about their special interests, about Super Mario, about Peppa Pig, about Hey Duggee, with them starring in the role, and suddenly we've everybody's noticing that not only is this child absolutely engaged and motivated in literacy, but they're making fabulous progress because we're not looking at units, we're looking at the whole. And there are lots of those moments that certainly I'm experiencing at the moment in some of the schools that I'm working in, which is really exciting.
And all of this is happening in primary school. And when they get to
Yes.
secondary education, it stops. It stops
Yeah.
being about special interests. It starts being about the canon of English literature. And it starts being about, I think about the spark for this current
Mm,
book, the whole of it as accommodation. In geometry,
mm,
it is part to whole. You
yeah.
must learn these concepts. And I have, I have to support an entire building. of science and mathematics. And I often have to differentiate lessons in the moment as improv. So I'm very fortunate that a lot of my occupational therapy as an autistic person happened in improv theater, right? So I gained those kind of in the moment language skills. And then, at my age, I have a lot of background knowledge now that I didn't have when I was that age.
Yeah.
Many of my colleagues are young enough to be my own children. So, I don't try to play that elder or whatever. I try to answer honestly. And so we talk about that kind of Peppa Pig and, Bluey and all of that kind of stuff.
Mm,
But we don't apply it in mathematics. We don't apply it in science, right? And so when a colleague asks me, about a particular kind of advanced trigonometry concept that is getting students ready for calculus, how would you do this? And I
mm,
respond exactly how I would do this. And they give me blank look, like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Right. And that happened recently, in the last week, where one of the final kind of assignments in what we call Algebra 2, which is really kind of advanced trigonometry, is the unit circle. All right. And you're
mm,
going through this whole kind of angles and measurements and, radian and so on. And it's so dry and it's part to whole. You consider the angle measurements between 0 and 90 degrees and what their, relationship is to radian and pi. And it's just this whole building block thing is for me, it doesn't work. And it's not how I
mm,
learned it. And so when I bring in how I learned it with a very simple question, why are we focusing in base 10? Why don't we convert it, since it's a circle, to base 60 and then everything's a whole number? And they look at me like I'm from Mars. Like, Jamie, how can we do this? Well, once you convert it, to base 60, now it's operating like a solar cycle. Now it's operating like, a proper astronomical thing. And
mm,
the numbers are now divisible and easy to remember. And we can see the whole of it. We can see the systems level of it. And then we can divide it up and it's easier to memorize. You know, 20 minutes, 20 seconds, these types of concepts are a lot easier than 2 pi over 3.
yeah.
Right. And then, they go from algebra 2 to pre-calculus, where in algebra 2 they are introduced about this time to the concept of the unit circle and arcs and radians and so on. And then a year from now, they're expected to operate this, and they're expected to have committed this whole circle and all of these coordinates to memory, and they're tested on
Mm,
it. And then they don't see it again. They're operating in it now. And a year ago in geometry, they were introduced to parts of it and
mhm,
parts of it. And so part of my complaint about the current curriculum, as evidenced in the whole of it as accommodation, is that in the way things are kind of breadcrumbed, something that happened in geometry last year for a student who is in Algebra 2 this year, and then is going to happen a year from now. They kind of remember this. There's no reinforcement. I know this as an athlete. If I was an incredible shot put thrower because I did 500 turns a day, not because I did 500 turns today and then a year later I was in competition and I was fabulous and I never did anything in between, right? And so all of these things that we know, we forget when we go to classrooms,
yeah.
right? And we think about, history class. And it's not really like we call our class world history, US history, whatever. What is history of the wars and conquests of capital, right? And you have to memorize these little parts, and there is no whole of it. And so there's nothing to scaffold, there's nothing to connect. You know, we say that, the Great War started on this day and the armistice was on this day. I was like,
Yeah.
as if the Great War just popped up out of nowhere, right? And why that is. And so, every single kind of class within our, California system, I have broken down. And, it's, you can see from the links from today, there's 4
Mm,
parts, and every one of
yeah.
those is a full chapter. And
Yeah.
so, the even the overall the summative assessments that we give at certain grade levels are attacked because we've just been doing that at my school. In California, especially, the 11th grade, year 11, is the most consequential of their entire school.
Yeah.
That's the test that they just finished taking, that I just finished proctoring for students with IEPs. And the scores of which, English and maths, these are communicated to colleges, not as entrance, but as placement. So if you have this kind of mismatch stuff and where mathematics should be. You don't have any kind of
Mhm.
system, all of it, whatever. And you're confronted with this test that doesn't speak the language of the curriculum that you have in your class. You kind of put it together, and our students don't do well. And when you don't do well on these particular tests, you're placed very low on
Mhm.
entry. And so if pre-calculus is the entry, the 101 level mathematics, you might be 3 or 4 levels below that, that you must take these 3 or 4 classes before they'll let you take pre-calculus. Well, that has time cost, that has money cost, right?
Yeah,
But no one goes back and says, well, we can see the whole of it now, and this curriculum is crap, and we must get rid of it. And we must, we must consider that there are many types of minds in the room.
yeah,
There are many sensitivities. We must think about ecology. Why is the student not learning? And we're not doing that. And so
no,
that's kind of the thing that happened, right?
yeah,
The one sentence from a colleague in the moment where he got it, but he brought the whole of it in as an accommodation, right? Contrary to the curriculum that they must, what do you notice? What do you wonder? Annotate. I don't know what the heck's going on here. How am I supposed to notice and wonder from a logarithm chart, right?
yeah,
And that to me was kind of the biggest folly. You place a logarithm chart in front of a student who doesn't really understand division and say, what do you notice and what do you wonder? Well, I notice numbers and I wonder what the heck I'm doing here in this class, right? And so I took a lesson from the story of maths and I taught them logarithms in 2 days and they loved it.
I'd love to be in one of your classes, I have to say.
Well, candy's free, so
There we go. Well, Jamie, I think sadly we will have to pause for today on that note and thinking about your wonderful mathematics class. I think it's something that I wished I'd had access to, certainly when I was in school. But and look forward to seeing you next week.
I look forward to seeing you next week. Hopefully nothing gets in the way as life tends to, but yes.
Thank you so much. I'll see you next week.
All right, see you next week.